Hello, everyone. It's Ted Bilich from Risk Alternatives. I just wanted to let you know that we'll be getting started at the top of the hour. Right now, according to my clock, it is 10:53 a.m.
Ted, can you see Molly and Julie have come into the webinar? They're the reason we're here.
Again, for those of you who have just joined us, this is Ted Bilich from Risk Alternatives in Arlington, Virginia. Thank you. We'll be starting at the top of the hour. It's about 10:56 a.m. right now. Good morning, everyone. Again, this is Ted Bilich from Risk Alternatives. Joining me is my colleague, Lenrow Lopez, also from Risk Alternatives. And we wanted to welcome you to this important webinar about nonprofit risk management in light of COVID. I wanted to start out by thanking Molly and Julie from Business Volunteers Unlimited, who were able to work so rapidly to put something like this together. It is critical to be able to be as open and fluid as possible during emergent times. And these are certainly turbulent times. So thank you so much. During the course of this webinar, I wanted to lay out a couple of ground rules. First of all, I'm going to keep everyone on mute except me and Linda, simply because we've found that Zoom gets chaotic if you don't do that. The second thing, though, is that we really are hoping to get input from you as participants. And the way that we'd like you to do that is at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A section. And if you click on that, you can put your questions in while we're doing the webinar itself. That way, if you put them there, we'll be able to see them and respond to them in an orderly fashion. There's also a chat function on Zoom, but the chat function, we would prefer you keep to things like if you can't see us or if you need to provide some sort of additional guidance to us during the course of the webinar. And with the chat function, keep in mind that you can either toggle it from chat as just to the panelists or chat to everyone. And so be mindful as you're using the chat function that you're making a choice about whether you are chatting to the entire group or just to the panelists. So bottom line is, if you have questions, use the Q&A function, which will help Linda and me as we go through an orderly webinar that allows us to be very responsive to you as audience participants. So to give you a little bit of background, Risk Alternatives was started back in 2013. I came out of a background of practicing law. In fact, many of you would be familiar with the law firm that I practiced with because it was Jones Day. I wasn't in the Cleveland office, but I spent a lot of time in Cleveland over the years. After many years at Jones Day, I started teaching at Georgetown Law School, and then I moved to Risk Alternatives because I decided I wanted to commit the second half of my life to helping organizations avoid breaking eggs in the first place, instead of having them break an egg and then the lawyers come in to clean it up. So that's my background in a nutshell. Linda came out of a background of many years of world-class project management and risk management at one of the largest engineering firms in the world. So she has worked on large projects and small projects for many years. Linda and I together have known each other for a long, long time. In fact, we went to high school in Southern Ohio before taking paths that ended up with us working as colleagues today. If we're going to talk about how you should respond to risk management, I wanted to give some common vocabulary to you. When we talk about risk management doesn't mean necessarily focusing on things that are bad. Risk simply means uncertainty. So when we talk about bad risks, we talk about uncertainties that could go wrong. We call them threats. And when we talk about good risks, uncertainties that could go right, we call them opportunities. If you want to have a risk management process, what you need to do is you need to develop a routine of working with your staff to identify threats and opportunities throughout your organization as a regular part of your business operations, and then responding to those threats or opportunities and assessing your reactions, and then doing that over and over again. If you do that, then you have a risk management process. You don't need to spend a lot of money to start, but it is a critical function for nonprofits to have. We're here today, though, to talk in particular about one threat that's looming over all of us right now, and that's the threat from coronavirus. We've heard a number of things in the field over the last couple of weeks. We've been talking to nonprofits and nonprofit funders throughout the United States, and we're hearing a substantial amount of fear and anxiety. From the nonprofit sector in particular, we're hearing concern about funding and concern about operations. On the other hand, we're hearing a substantial outpouring from the nonprofit sector of wanting to collaborate, people wanting to acknowledge that they are not alone in this battle, that other organizations in other communities are facing the same sorts of questions, that organizations within their own communities want to collaborate even outside of their subject area in order to fight this crisis. And then we're also hearing just a tremendous outpouring of people who are willing to do whatever it takes. I've been really heartened by the response of funders thus far, and I expect that there will be greater response over the coming weeks and months. We see some movement at the federal level and some movement at the Ohio state level to support the nonprofit sector in particular, but to support all communities throughout the United States as we face this crisis. So it isn't all bad news. Risk management, after all, like I said, is not about looking for bad things. Risk management is being radically candid about what is currently going on and then taking the next reasonable step in order to respond to those issues. Whoops. When we're doing our discussions of risk management, both with our clients and also in the substantial number of webinars that we've been involved in over the last week and a half, we've boiled our core advice down into 4 themes. The first theme would be if you are working for a nonprofit or you are working as a volunteer with a nonprofit, you should be helping that nonprofit first build business continuity. By that we mean the organization should have a basic plan in place so that it knows who is working from home, what their contacts are, what essential personnel are out in the field, if any, and why they are out, what alternative ways there are to keep in touch with people, who the major emergency personnel are that the organization needs to keep in touch with, what their phone numbers are. Same thing with insurers and other important personnel for the nonprofit. Now, I know that's a lot to grapple with, and so I would advise that you go to our website, riskalts.com. That's riskalts.com, and you will find a business continuity template that you can download for free. That's a good way for you to check to see whether your current business continuity plans are consistent with best practices without overwhelming yourself, because I know that you're probably feeling overwhelmed right now. The second bit of advice that we give is something that Ohioans have been hearing for a while. I think your governor's done a good job of getting out in front in terms of suggesting social distancing. I would take that a step further, though. After you've made sure of business continuity for your organization, I want you to take it upon yourselves to ensure that you and your organization are not a vector for disease. What that means is you need to modify your conduct to make sure that you are scrupulously adhering to the federal and state guidance that's out there. Even if you need to cut back your operations to some extent in the short run, make sure that you are not a vector for the spread and continuity of this disease. Trust me, I've heard from people who have had anguish because they had personnel out in the field at the beginning of this crisis, and they were worried about their personnel, and they were worried about their beneficiary populations, and they didn't want to be a part of the problem, but they worried that they were. Don't face that second guessing. Make sure now that you're following all the social distancing guidelines scrupulously. Err in favor of reducing your operations in order to help beat this disease. The third thing that I would point to is once you've established business continuity and once you've made sure that you're not a vector through proper social distancing, we would look toward that magnifying glass in the lower right-hand corner of my screen here. And that signifies the notion of identifying threats and opportunities besides COVID throughout your organization. There's a basic tool of risk management called a risk inventory. And you can either do this on your own or you can get someone like us or some other organization to help you with it. But a risk inventory is a structured inquiry that you could take your senior staff through that would allow you to see not only whether you're facing any risks relating to COVID, but whether there are any other glaring risks that are either coming out of the COVID crisis or that otherwise could undermine your operations in the short run. Because again, you want to make sure that you are resilient in the face of this crisis. It could be that COVID itself is not the most worrisome thing in this crisis for you. You might find by doing a risk inventory, for instance, that you have an underlying talent management issue where people are very disgruntled. Maybe that's being exacerbated by having to stay at home. You might find that you have an underlying financial issue relating to controls that could mean that you don't have the sort of resources that you think you have. And so once you've dealt with basic business continuity and made sure that you've done social distancing, then you do need to be alert to the other issues that your organization may be confronted with so that you aren't forced into tunnel vision by this crisis. Then the final bit of advice that we give as overarching advice for dealing with this situation is represented by the eggs in the lower left-hand corner of my slide. That is trying to signify that COVID is something that you should put in context in the future as well. And the way to do that is through scenario planning. Now, a lot of people misunderstand scenario planning. They think that scenario planning is about forecasting into the future what is going to happen. Scenario planning is something different. Scenario planning is imagining that something has happened as of a particular point in time, and then considering how you might have gotten there in the future and what you might be able to do in response in the present day in order to make yourself more robust, in order to mitigate that future, if it's a bad future, or stimulate that future, develop that future if it's a possible good future, an opportunity. So let me give you some practical examples. One scenario you might use either, with the nonprofit that you work for or the nonprofit that you volunteer for or are on the board of, is you might hypothesize as a group that you're now in November and you're facing two facts of life. The one fact of life is that you have about 15% greater demand for your services because for whatever reason, people have expressed greater need for what you do than had been happening back in the current day. On the other hand, however, you face a 15% reduction in available resources. So you have a gap. That gap is something that is present to you in November. How can you use that for scenario planning? Well, you think about it in a couple of ways. First, you can ask yourself as a group, how likely is that scenario to play out? And in answering that question, you should make your assumptions expressed, because by talking about the assumptions that each of you has in answering that question, you may uncover things that are really subject to debate and inquiry. A second question that you might ask is, well, in that eventuality, what would we be doing? What would be sort of on the chopping block that we could cut back on? And what would we be able to do to modify our services to allow for us to respond to the surge in demand, notwithstanding the reduction in resources? A third way you could approach that scenario would be to say, okay, if this is something that is reasonably possible, what can we do today to make ourselves potentially more robust so that if this comes down the pike and happens in November, we are prepared? Now, remember what I said though, risk management, including scenario planning, is not just about planning for potential bad things. Risk management and scenario planning should also involve good things, opportunities. So also consider this scenario as a group. What if we find ourselves in, let's say, October or November, not only with our current budget, but some funder or group of funders has decided to give us 25% more of our funds than we had before we started this crisis. Now, a couple of questions to ask about that one too, right? First of all, is that a reasonable possibility? Maybe it's too blue sky and you can't focus on that. Maybe, but make your assumptions express when you do that, because you might find that there are ways that that could be a realistic possibility for your organization. Second, if that were to happen, what would you be doing with that extra 25% of budget? Third, well, if it is a possibility, can we increase the possibility of that good future event now by taking certain steps? Could we, for instance, cultivate certain understandings with potential new funders that might bear that sort of fruit in October? Or could we reach out to funders with certain proofs of the demand for our services that would allow the funder to come around in August or September and say, hey, we are going to give you a special grant come the late fall? So by using scenario planning, you're not predicting the future or forecasting the future, but you're reflecting on the present in different ways because of the contemplation of potential future events. That's the power of scenario planning, and it can make an enormous difference in terms of your resilience and sustainability over time. So now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn to the sorts of risks you may be sharing now. And for that, I want both Linda and me on screen, and I think we are. And I know that we've collected some questions already, but we'd really like you to add additional questions as we continue so that we can make sure that we are responding. Let me see. I heard rumor that Linda is not on screen. So let me see if I can get her on video. Linda, you might need to do that on yours.
Hi, Ted. Am I visible now?
I don't know. You're visible to me.
Okay, great. I just got word that I'm visible. So
excellent. Excellent. And thank you all for understanding that technology is going to cause havoc for all of us for a little bit. And so we're all doing this in real time. Linda, you had some questions that you'd gathered from Molly and Julie, I think, in advance of this. And we also have some questions that we've heard in other webinars that we've done. Why don't you start us out, and then we can see if other questions come in.
Great, I'll do that. I do encourage everybody to use the Q&A feature. And as we go through some of the questions and answers we have right now, they may spark additional questions you have. So I'll be monitoring the Q&A feature. So the first question that came from this team, Ted, is should organizations change or adapt their standard liability waivers for volunteers to include specific statements about risks of contracting COVID-19, as long as the organization is allowing volunteers to opt into service and that organization is taking appropriate measures to protect volunteers, staff, and the community by instituting CDC recommended guidelines like PPE and social distancing? Should they change their liability waivers?
My advice on that is, well, let me put a proviso out there because, of course, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer who's a member of the Ohio Bar, and I'm not going to give legal advice on this. And ultimately, this may be one that if you're contemplating doing this, it would be useful to ask for legal advice as you go forward in making that provision. Having said that, however, I think that as a matter of risk management, it is a prudent consideration to include it as part of your waivers. But you should understand in doing so that you're going to, you need to, of course, be scrupulous in your adherence to all the social distancing norms and any regulations that are in your state or municipal locality. And you also should be just aware as a practical matter that damage waivers they don't prevent litigation. They simply can inhibit some people from bringing claims. Linda, you've dealt with waivers in a variety of contexts. Would you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's good advice, Ted. We can't completely protect ourselves. The only other thing is if you're concerned about something, talk to your liability, your general liability insurance fellows or folks. If you're from Ohio, folks is a universal term, but go ahead and talk to them about that and get their advice.
Great.
On how that flanges up with the insurance policy.
Okay. What's our next question?
There's another question, Ted, about, again, uses the word legal. Are there any legal concerns that organizations should be aware of when instituting practices such as taking a volunteer or a staff member's temperature before they're being allowed to conduct work, or turning them away if they're demonstrating a fever or other symptoms? So, what concerns should organizations have about that?
It's a really good question, and I'm going to answer in a weaselly way. I'm going to answer, first of all, that legal issues may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and we're not here to provide legal advice. That said, I think that you can certainly be very clear with people that you're trying to look out for the health of the organization. And it's my expectancy that if you were to say one of the conditions of us having you be a volunteer is that we be permitted to check your temperature, that's certainly a reasonable risk management step to take. It's a reasonable step to take from the standpoint of being a good member of the community. And so whether or not there might be legal liability that might attach, I think that it may be sufficiently prudent that you would do it even if there were some potential that it might trigger some legal liability. Because I could see down the road being able to make a very strong argument that in good faith, you were simply trying to protect the health and welfare of your volunteers and your employees and your beneficiaries. So while you may want to seek legal advice, and it wouldn't be a crazy thing to do so, And I haven't seen any advice yet. We'll continue to be looking for it, and we'll post it to our website if we find it. But while you might want to seek legal advice, as a risk management prudence matter, I think it does make sense for you to be alert to whether you're dealing with populations that may be ill.
Ted, I've got a thought as well on that. It may be difficult to obtain them at this point, but going back to your earlier primary piece of advice about not being a vector, if you can avoid using oral thermometers and instead use an ear or a forehead thermometer, we went through a burst on the internet where you couldn't order thermometers, and I'll concede that it's an expense that the organization would have to carry themselves to procure the thermometers. But it would be great if you're having to do that to avoid using oral thermometers, because those themselves can become a vector for disease amongst yourselves and your volunteers. So if you can get the ear or the forehead swipe kind, that's great.
Goodness knows. Although, yeah, with the forehead swipe one, be sure that you're cleaning it after each swipe too.
Yeah. So Ted, how are nonprofits distinguishing their need for immediate cash from deeper organizational or structural issues?
This is a great question, and it harkens back to some extent to one of our general pieces of advice that I gave a few minutes ago. And that is, don't be distracted by COVID. COVID is an emergency. And of course, we need to respond to an emergency with appropriate steps. But the deeper issues are quite strong here, and they could easily swamp your nonprofit if you don't pay attention to the deeper issues. I'm always reminded by when I think of this of, I don't know how many of you saw the original Jurassic Park, and there's the Australian poacher who is walking through the forest, and he's hunting for one of the raptors, and he thinks he's about to get them, and another one sneaks up next to him. It's that sneaky one that you got to look out for. And so once you've looked at the basic response to COVID, you should take some time to do an inventory, a structured inquiry into the issues that your organization is facing. And in doing so, I want to emphasize a critical point, which is most people think of risk management as dealing with things from the outside that can impact them. Things like pandemics or large economic forces. I'm not going to discount those, especially in today's environment. But the research overwhelmingly shows that most risks within for an organization are internal. Sometimes up to 90% of the activities of even the best run organization are of no value to that organization or are actually harmful to the organization. That's not just Ted Bilich saying that. I'm parroting one of the most important management consultants of the 20th century, a man named Peter Drucker, who, after studying the best organizations, said most organizations spend a lot of their effort on things that are ultimately wasteful to the ultimate consumer. I don't look at that with dismay. I look at that as a potential pot of gold. That means even in an emergency, even in something like the COVID crisis, you may find that by looking at your operations, you may be able to modify those operations in order to unlock value rather than facing some sort of budgetary or operational crisis.
Ted, I'm going to pivot to some of the questions we've just gotten into the Q&A before I go back to the ones that we received in advance.
It's a great idea.
And we've been asked from executive director of a small but sustainable nonprofit providing youth programs. Their current and pending funders have indicated that they will continue to support and collaborate with them. And the question is, how can we use this to build our organization to become more visible online and via mail to increase our outreach to youth and families? So this is risk management opportunity, I think.
Absolutely, and I appreciate this question because it does emphasize that I don't want to use the trite notion of a silver lining. Instead, I want to use the very realistic notion of radical awareness of what's going on. There may be opportunities here. And where there is opportunity, you definitely ought to try to build it out. In particular for this organization, what I would suggest is the following. Certainly, you should be taking advantage of online resources to build that out. And if you wanted to get some additional online resources, you could follow up with Linda and me after this webinar, and we could talk about some of the ways that we contemplate outreach and how you might be able to do some of the same things to organizations that might use your efforts. But in doing so, one thing I would be mindful of is when exploring opportunities, it's usually better to pilot them out than to push all of your chips in at once and try to really capitalize. That way you get a chance to see how the market responds and then modify your conduct in response. So I would say definitely take advantage, but don't overextend yourself. Make sure that you are ensuring business continuity as a first priority.
Ted, another question. At the moment, that same organization is in a downtime because their programs don't kick off until June. So things being what they are, what proactive things can they be doing now for their volunteers, staff, and board members, as well as reaching out to clients and potential new clients? What kind of aggressive new things could they be thinking of doing?
I think that's a great question. I'm not sure that I can give particular advice, during the course of the webinar, because it probably would require some additional factual context. But there are things that you can do, and it is tremendous to think of the notion that if you have a little bit of downtime, you might be able to take some steps that would improve things. Now, one thing I would say, and this will mirror some advice that I'll summarize later, is that if you have a little bit of downtime right now, I would advise all of you and your staff to be taking time to document what you do in your daily activities. Now, I don't mean write a 30-page dissertation, but I do mean have each part of your staff take time to get things out of their head and onto paper. That has a couple of benefits. The first benefit is that by doing that, in case, God forbid, someone within your organization succumbs to COVID and becomes incapable of performing their tasks, they will have already documented their basic tasks so that others can fill in the gap. So that's good thing number one that happens from documenting. But good thing number two that happens from documenting is that you end up identifying ways that you're currently doing things that could be improved. And you may well find out that when different people document the same process from different perspectives, actually, your process is not being done the same in each circumstance. And therefore, you're facing ambiguity and waste because different people are following different guidelines in order to accomplish the same tasks. So that's something you could be doing in your downtime. And it's something that even as to those of you who are not facing a downtime, even of those of you who are in crisis mode, if you can take a little bit of time to document the most important things you're doing and how you do them, you may be increasing sustainability and resilience over the long run.
Ted, we've got another question, and I've got a thought on it as well, but someone is providing band programs to parochial schools, and they want to know how to plan and budget for next school year if they don't know how many current families will drop out of their schools. If a third of the people are out of work or, somehow still going to their school, they may not be able to afford the tuition for the program. So the nut of the question is they're worried that by outright asking families of their plans, they're going to seem unsympathetic and rude. and they're kind of wondering how to navigate that situation.
Sure. Well, Linda, you said you had some thoughts. I do too. You want to go first?
Well, sure. Um, so Debbie's the one that asked this question, and Debbie, I would say that if you're providing a service that people count on, and you've got a band program that people really count on, and everyone knows that we are in a situation at present that has a lot of variables, no one's sure what's going to happen. I would say that if you do it in a thoughtful manner, saying that you're very excited to continue to provide a benefit to the community, that you're very concerned that your program be allowed to go forward because you know the kids count on it, and you're just asking for general interest, I think I would give it a little bit of time, because we are all sort of in the beginning stages of understanding the magnitude of how long we're going to be considered to stay indoors, etc. Life hasn't really returned back to normal. But I would say that worrying about seeming unsympathetic and rude, I would turn that around and say you're excited to be continuing to provide a very valuable service, and you're querying your families to reassure them that you will still be there with this service, and at the same time you've got some information you would love to know from them as early as they're able to know it. And so that's not, to me, unsympathetic or rude. You're still excited to perform a benefit and a service. That's my thought.
And that's one of the reasons why I enjoy working with you, is that I think that's exactly the right approach. I would add an additional point, which is one way to approach that, Debbie, would also be asking with curiosity whether there are ways to bring some of this online in some way or another. You might find that even if band members can't play in a concert, they may be able to play in some way that contributes to a greater whole that could be compiled online. I think that it's entirely feasible to at least raise that issue. And even if what ended up happening was a total musical train wreck, I think the very fact of being willing to try to move toward a continuation of that community would itself be a delightful thing. Again, I'm reminded of the final scene in The Music Man when all the band players play, and it sounds horrible to everyone except the band players, who are delighted that they were able to play their musical instruments. So
it sounds like my musical career, Ted.
So
8 years of piano, and I only harmed people. So
I think, Debbie, that Linda's point of reaching out with compassion and curiosity is certainly worthwhile. And I don't think it would be viewed as unsympathetic or rude at all.
Ted, I'm going to move off the live questions because we're getting some new ones. I'm going to allow them to kind of flow in, because we did have a number of people that took the time to ask questions before the session, and I'd like to move to those questions. So the folks that have questions in the open window, I will get back to those. And since we have a lot, I'm going to kind of pick up my pace so that we can try to get these all in. If a nonprofit applies for the Paycheck Protection Program, which is part of the CARES Act, and there are now 3 aspects of the CARES Act that have been released, if they apply for the Paycheck Protection Loan and over the course of the loan agreement, the nonprofit goes out of business, is there any liability to board members or staff in repaying the loan?
That's a good question. It is a legal question that would have to be answered under Ohio and federal law. As a risk management issue, my instinct is that at least without providing legal advice and without having explored the legal issues and seen whether there are any regulations that actually directly address this, my instinct from a risk management perspective would be that the risk of that occurring is relatively low relative to the benefit of being able to continue the nonprofit in the short run and perhaps into the longer term. So from a risk management perspective, my instinct would be to say, while we may want to inquire into this, it shouldn't inhibit us from moving forward with the process in the short run. If you are really feeling that you may face, imminent demise, then it would be something that I would suggest you explore with a lawyer or some other legal advice.
And if you, whoever's asking questions about the CARES Act, please do pay very close attention to our website. We've been updating our links and our answers on our website as more information becomes available. And Ted and I have been ourselves attending webinars by experts that are part of the advocacy program dealing directly with the government to make these things happen. The PPP program and the EIDL, which is pronounced the EIDL program for the loans through the SBA. So we will continue to keep our thumb on that, and do go to the Risk Alternatives COVID-19 resources page for not only questions when we get specific answers to things, but lots of really good links. I'm going to do something that drives Ted absolutely crazy, but he has a superpower that you're taking advantage of when you go to that website. His lawyer brain reads voluminous amounts of information. He clicks tremendous volumes of links in order to distill only the most relevant issues and pieces of information and put them onto our COVID-19 website specifically. But in general, when you go on our website, there isn't anything on there that Ted hasn't researched to the end of the earth and back, and I thank God it's his superpower. But you can count on Risk Alternatives to ensure that the information that we put on our website has been vetted. We don't just throw up a bunch of links and hope for the best. So let me dive into the next question so we can get lots more answered in the next 15 minutes. The individual here has a summer internship program that includes housing. And if the housing continues, it may be at reduced density as part of the program in the event that one of the interns gets sick, assuming all state and federal orders are followed. So it would be a change to the living arrangement. The question is, has there been any insight from the medical and legal community as of yet regarding any housing and density for programs like this? And I'm going to interject that this could apply to not just summer internships that include housing, but perhaps camping facilities that would have housing involved.
And my answer to this question is that we have not yet seen any definitive guidance. I think that we probably will see some emerging guidance in the near future. One thing that we are trying to do is we're trying to bring together groups of organizations that face similar issues so that they don't have to answer the same question over and over again. While I don't have any definitive guidance, I do think that your touchstone has to be, back to do not become a part of the problem. Make sure you're erring in favor of avoiding any situation that could create a vector for continued disease.
I'm going to use that as a segue to a question that is on the open Q&A, and I'm going out of order here, folks, so I'm aware of that. But we've got a question regarding whether or not it's worth reporting a company that's not following basic rules and protecting their employees. And
yeah, I mean, my sense is it depends the question. It depends whether the question is it worth it? Meaning, is something going to get done, or is it worth it because it's your solemn duty? I think different people might feel, might reach different conclusions about that. I do think that if you see something, you should say something. If you are aware of organizations that are putting the community at risk, then I think it is worth raising that issue, or at least finding out from your local authorities whether that is something that they want to hear. There are always, police non-emergency lines and things like that that you might be able to use in order to find out what the definitive guidance is as simply a community member. And so, yes, I would say you can at least make that inquiry.
Yes, and I am aware that there are, again, in our research, I'm aware there are some communities that actually have published phone numbers to report people that are congregating or not following the rules. And they're often non-emergency numbers, but they've been put out there specifically for COVID-19. Even small communities like Highland Park, Illinois, have such numbers because the concern is, of course, being a vector. So I'm going to move to another question off of the earlier set. And this is from a board chair who doesn't want to bother their executive director at this time, so thinking they should cancel their next few meetings until it blows over. The question is, how can they be supportive of their ED while keeping their distance?
Wonderful question. Such a thoughtful thing for a board chair to be thinking through right now. And of course, a nonprofit board has an important role in the COVID crisis. That role is predominantly support. The role is predominantly to make sure that the executive director feels that he or she can turn to the board for not just financial support, but support in terms of reaching out to networks if there's a talent management or a reputation management or a compliance issue, that he or she can turn to the board and the board will be able to respond with connections that executive director can rely upon to get the answers that she needs. One thing I would say, though, is that the board chair should not try to read the mind of the executive director. I think that radical candor is, again, the best approach here. And so the board chair, rather than unilaterally canceling the next few meetings, should raise the question with the executive director and together reach a decision. Because it would be entirely appropriate, for instance, for the executive director to continue to correspond regularly with the board chair, and the board chair in turn to take it upon themselves to notify the board and to serve as a buffer between the board membership at large and the executive director. In that way, the board chair will serve as a conduit and a buffer, but also as a means of support and consolation during these challenging times.
Absolutely. I'm skipping around, folks. How can I convince another board member, how can I convince my organization's staff leadership that succession planning is important? They're afraid to bring it up because they don't want them to think we're planning on them leaving. And interestingly, I think COVID-19 just gives you a brilliant entree to be able to talk about this.
Yeah, I think Linda's right. Succession planning is a critical part of everyday operations of an organization, even in the best of times. In times when you could face a temporary or unfortunately extended absence by senior leadership, it becomes even more important. There are really strong tools out there, and if the questioner wants to reach out to us afterwards, to either Linda or me, we can connect you with some of those very good resources that would help you be able to raise the issue and help you be able to walk through both emergency succession planning and succession planning in a more modeled, in a more reasoned framework down the road. So important issue.
And for those that aren't watching the chat, Julie chimed in on what Ted was just saying to comment that boards do have to continue meeting. They're ultimately accountable for sustainability of the organization. They can use virtual meetings, but Julie reminds everybody that BVU does succession planning and they're happy to help. So don't forget your resources here.
Absolutely. And I strongly endorse you going to BVU and checking on their resources.
Couple of other questions, Ted, as we reach the 10-minute to the end mark. The first is regarding sample tools to make scenario plans. I know we've got a couple things on the website as suggestions, but what kinds of sample tools would we be able to provide to make scenario plans?
Again, these questions are so amazing. I'm going to answer that in two ways. The first one is uh, if someone wants to learn about scenario planning, there's a book, and it's a book by Peter Schwartz. I always get the title slightly wrong, but I think it's called The Art of the Long View. Linda, do you
Close.
remember?
Yeah, you're close. We do this
It,
every time.
it, but either Linda or Heather will put it in the chat so that people can capture it. Peter was a longtime employee of the Shell Oil Corporation. And he has a very practical approach to scenario planning that that I think is it's one of those go buy the book and read the book, and it's a good book. That said, though, I it's The Art of the Long View. Okay, good. The that said, though, this question has come up in every webinar that we've done over the last 2 weeks, and it has stimulated the fact that in the next, hopefully, 3 or 4 days, I will be doing a video that gets to this direct issue and provides resources for how you can go engage in scenario planning within your organization. So stay tuned. You can look to our YouTube page, which is called Nonprofit Risk Management, and you'll probably find sometime within the next 2 or 3 weeks a set of videos that would take you through that process. We're also probably going to develop some sort of masterclass on that because it is something that deserves a fuller treatment, and we'll keep you apprised of that as well.
I'm going to take that moment to remind everybody on the call that not only do we have a YouTube channel where we put out informational videos, but we're getting ready to stand up a virtual education platform. And once we do that, if you go onto our website and let us know that you're interested, you could download any of our free stuff. That'll tell us right there. But you can go onto our website. If we've got your information on our website, you will be part of the team of folks that not only do we tell when we stand these things up, but for some of you, if you're interested in sort of being part of a pilot and sort of getting in early, there may be some advantages to getting in early when we stand these things up. So you're encouraged to go to the website, and we'll let you know when more information is coming your way. Ted, we've got another question, and I'm going to need help. If you're on the line and you ask this question, I'm watching the question and answer box right now to see if I get this wrong, I'd like you to please clarify how I'm phrasing this. The question is, what if I had an employee that just didn't feel comfortable working, and I believe you mean working from home, prior to the stay-at-home order? They never sought out alternatives, they just bailed, not to care for anyone or because they felt ill. And I think what you're asking is what do you do if you had an employee that didn't feel comfortable working from home? If I'm not correctly stating your question, throw your question into the chat. And
Yeah.
I'll take a
So
look.
I'll answer that question as Linda presented it, and it is a little ambiguous. One thing to be mindful of, just as a conscientious employer, is that no doubt everyone on this call has seen things from the National Domestic Violence Hotline that has noted the fact that stay-at-home orders can have pernicious effects in contexts in which there might be potential domestic violence. And so, you know, as you're thinking through these issues, I'm not saying that there's any sort of domestic violence aspect to this employee's reaction, but it is sometimes the case that those sorts of issues will arise when people are asked to stay at home or go on vacation or things like that. So that's sort of point number one, is to be mindful of the broader context there. Now, as to the notion of an employee just being disobedient and being unwilling to abide by reasonable guidelines of an organization that you set forth about how the organization is going to act in the short run, well, that's an employment matter. And I don't remember whether Ohio is an employment at will state, but in most jurisdictions, and again, this would start getting into law, in most jurisdictions, an employer has the ability to discipline or even terminate an employee who doesn't follow reasonable conditions of work. In fact, in employment at will situations, employers can terminate an employee, without giving legal advice, for no reason at all, essentially. That's why it's called at will employment. So if this is a circumstance in which an employee is refusing to abide by the company's rules, well, that can be handled as a simple employment matter, regardless of COVID. COVID doesn't create special circumstances of which I'm aware, at least in terms of risk management, that would make you particularly worried about taking actions with respect to this employee. On the other hand, if the employee has some sort of, special medical condition that requires accommodation, well, that too would be something that you'd want to inquire about. Ultimately, I think that your counsel here would be to, check with a lawyer about whether there are any special conditions that you would need to be aware of, and then take the reasonable steps that you would as an employer in response to this employee.
Ted, I believe we've got one more question we can answer because we're going to have to wrap it up, but it's a great question, so I don't want to hesitate to ask it. Question is, they are just starting strategic planning, and should they move forward given the uncertainty, or put strategic planning on hold, or do a shorter process?
That is a great question. The way that I would answer that question is, it depends on whether you already have a risk management process in place. If you already have a risk management process in place, so that you have a matter of routine where you identify threats and opportunities and prioritize them and address them and respond to them and do that same thing over and over again, well, then I would say, sure, go forward with your strategic planning process, because you have this background of awareness about what the big issues are with your organization. On the other hand, if you don't have a if you don't have a risk management process in place and you're just considering going forward with strategic planning, I would suggest that you first at least take a nibble at risk management before you go into strategic planning. If you can first do a little bit of risk inventorying and prioritizing of those risks at the staff level, you will find that you are going to be much stronger when you go through your strategic planning process. In fact, if you go to our YouTube channel, the first video that you'll see on the left-hand side, I believe, is something that says strategic plan or strategic hope. It's up to you. And that's my point, is that unless you have underlying risk management, any sort of strategic plan is nothing more than a strategic guess or a strategic hope. So now let me move back to finishing up here, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so I'm going to go back to my screen and share it again and just summarize some advice. Here's our core advice that I hope that you take away from this webinar. First of all, ensure business continuity, even if that means that in the short run, you need to modify your conduct and reduce the number of beneficiaries you serve. Second one is, don't be a part of the problem. At all costs, make sure that you are preserving social distancing and good practices for health and public welfare. Third, definitely inventory your risks. Don't focus on COVID to the extent that you ignore other things that may be going wrong in your organization or that may be going right. Next, scenario planning. We've already touched on it, and you'll see more from us down the road. You heard me mention about how key personnel should take the time to document what you do. By keeping it short, you'll make sure that in the event that someone falls ill, others can step into the breach. Create networks of peer organizations with whom you can share concerns. The BVU is part of that, but it may not be the whole of it. You may be able to find that there are other peer organizations that can be focused on the same sorts of issues and can provide support and counsel to you as you move forward. This didn't come up so much in our answer to the questions today, but I do want to emphasize that one thing you can do, even if you have to cut back on your activities to beneficiaries, is you certainly can advocate on behalf of them. Yes, nonprofit 501c3s are supposed to avoid political activities. But if you look at what that means, the limits on political activities tend to be very constrained. One thing you certainly can do is give voice to those who are in need. And so as you look forward through this crisis, make sure that your beneficiaries' voices are being heard loud and clear within your communities. Finally, seek financial support. Don't try to weather this on your own. Look for foundation support, federal SBA support, the federal stimulus package, state relief. All those things should be on the table. They may be your best short-term development activities. Together, we're going to get through this. We really are going to emerge through to the other side. As you get toward the other side, I asked you to look immediately for 3 resources. First is downloading our COVID response checklist. It's very useful and very actionable. The second thing is I would consider downloading our risk inventory guide. I say consider because that one does have a price tag involved, and I'm not here to sell you on that. The third thing, though, I'd say is definitely bookmark our coronavirus nonprofit risk page. Whether or not I have a superpower, and I don't think I do, I certainly am in good faith trying to make sure that I keep abreast of the most important issues that are facing the nonprofit sector, and that I winnow those resources down to the ones that I think are going to be of most benefit to the nonprofits who work with us. So that's all we have time for today. In fact, we've gone slightly overboard, but we will make sure that we provide you a recording after the fact, and we hope that you will reach out to us and continue the dialogue so that we all get stronger through this. Thank you so much, and I hope you remain happy and safe and healthy throughout the crisis.